Welcome, everyone. My name is Daphne Lei, the Director of Illuminations and Professor of Drama. Before we start, we would like to acknowledge that the UCI campus and most of the Orange County is located on the shared homelands of the Kakman and Tongva people, and who continue to live here and claim their ancestral lands, and as they have for the past 8,000 years. And we wish to acknowledge that, and that everyone of the UCI community has and continue to benefit from the use of the occupation of this land. So it is my greatest pleasure today to open this event and to welcome everyone to this event and our distinguished guest, the Pulitzer Prize winning author, Viet Thanh Nguyen. Before I hand it over to Dr. Thuy Vo Dang, who will introduce Dr. Viet Thanh Nguyen, and I would like to thank our co-sponsors. They are UCI Humanities Center, especially Director Dr. Judy Wu, an Advisory Council on Campus Climate, Culture, and Inclusion, Office of Inclusive Excellence, Southeast Asian Archive, Vietnamese American Arts and Letters Association, and UCI's Vietnamese American Alumni Chapter. And also I would like to thank Professor Linda Vo of Asian American Studies, and also Professor Julia Lupton, the former director of Illuminations, who oversaw the entire event, the process. And of course, our amazing staff, Debbie Nelson. And thank you all for supporting Illuminations and co-sponsoring this event. And so during this talk, please feel free to chat in the chat box. We also have a Q&A afterwards. Please post your question in the Q&A box. Just before the talk, we posted 2 events. If you haven't had the time to check it out, please do. One is for the UCI undergrads. One is an exhibit that is happening right now. So now I will hand the mic over to Dr. Thuy Vo Dang, the curator of the Southeast Asian Archive and research librarian for Asian American Studies at UCI, to introduce our guest today.
Thank you so much, Professor Daphne Lei. Hi, everyone, and happy Lunar New Year. It's the 3rd day of the Year of the Tiger, and I'm excited to be in community with our audience tonight as we welcome a scholar and a friend, Viet Thanh Nguyen. My name is Thuy Vo Dang. I'm the curator for the UCI Library's Southeast Asian Archive. It's a collection of historical records and books documenting the Cambodian, Hmong, Laotian, and Vietnamese diaspora. I'm really excited to represent my colleagues at UCI to introduce our special guest. Of course, you're all here because you know of Viet Thanh Nguyen's impressive body of work, so I will make my introductions brief. Viet Thanh Nguyen is a writer and distinguished scholar. His best-known work, The Sympathizer, has won numerous awards, including the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for fiction, and it sold over 1 million copies worldwide. The sequel, The Committed, was published in 2021. He has written for the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and numerous academic journals. His accomplishments are too numerous to mention here, but I will share that his work has personally inspired me because he models creative and thoughtful strategies to create platforms for storytelling in our Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. He is the founding editor of the blog Diacritics through the Diasporic Vietnamese Artists Network, which is focused on the diaspora. I can still remember when Diacritics was the hot and new thing, and I was a contributing blogger. It not only presented voices from within our community to the world, but it also built a sense of solidarity among us. My acquaintance with Viet Thanh Nguyen began in academia. Initially, to me, he was Professor Nguyen, mentoring and paving the way for many of us doing work on the Vietnamese diaspora. Today, he's the Aerol Arnold Chair of English, as well as a professor of English, American Studies and Ethnicity, and Comparative Literature at the University of Southern California. His academic book, Nothing Ever Dies, Vietnam and the Memory of War, is a must-read for those seeking to understand the afterlives of war and the ways cultural memory becomes the battleground for post-war generations. Last year, as we were envisioning Viet Thanh Nguyen's visit to our campus, and we were really optimistic and hopeful that it might have been in person, Professor Julia Lupton asked what other arts and cultural programming we might do to sync up with this important visit. And of course, with the support of Professor Judy Wu and the Humanities Center, we created an opportunity to engage our students. So undergraduate curators Mary Nguyen, Louis Hine, and Annie Nguyen worked with me for about 4 months to put together a digital exhibition called Literally Displaced, Writing the Southeast Asian Diaspora. And the link is there in the chat for you. It is now live. We will have a physical exhibit to accompany this in the Orange County and Southeast Asian Archive Center starting on March 1st, and it will run through April 30th of this year. So when we were envisioning this exhibit, I reached out to Viet and I asked for Southeast Asian authors' names that we could do research on and add additional archival materials and historical context. And so the list of authors that you see are recommendations from Viet, as well as a page that's dedicated to him, of course. So for tonight, I thought it might be kind of fun to share a little trivia about Viet Thanh Nguyen. Most people won't know this, but he and I share a middle name, Thanh. So its meaning is commonly in the Vietnamese language, brilliant, bright, clear blue, or pure. So I'm honored tonight to welcome the brilliant Viet Thanh Nguyen back to UCI. He was here in 2017 as the Chancellor's Fellow. And earlier today, he visited Professor Linda Voss' Asian American Studies class. This past week, our UCI community has prepared for his visit through 2 reading group discussions for his short story collection, The Refugees, which I happen to have right here on my desk. So what a treat tonight for us. And I know that many in the audience will have tons of questions for him. Viet's talk tonight is Refugees, Language, and the Meaning of America. Please help me welcome Professor Viet Thanh Nguyen.
Hi, Thuy. Thanks so much for that introduction. And I'm so delighted to be back here at Irvine with all of you. And of course, I wanted to be here in person. And this was a suit I was going to wear with my visit to Irvine. So just in honor of that occasion, this is what I'm wearing. I'm even wearing the pants. So I'm completely dressed up for you. And, I was also looking forward just to being physically in Irvine because it is close to Little Saigon. I would have made a trip to Little Saigon. And of course, Little Saigon is so important because it's the heart of the Vietnamese diaspora. And I love visiting it, but it always leaves me with somewhat of mixed feelings because it reminds me of coming to the United States as a refugee. And I came when I was 4 years old. And back then I was fluent in Vietnamese. And when I visit Orange County and Little Saigon and hear people speaking Vietnamese, it reminds me I'm still fluent in Vietnamese at a 4-year-old level. So, I talk a lot about being a refugee, and I always use the present tense, which might be kind of odd to call myself a refugee in that way, because it's pretty clear that I've long ago made the transition from refugee to bourgeoisie, from camps to clubs. But my first memories begin in a refugee camp in the United States. So that's why I call myself a refugee. And using this word is very important to me. And so this talk is about the importance of language in describing reality and the way that language carries ideology with it and the way that we call ourselves becomes so important as well. So in immigrant and refugee literature, which I write about often, especially in memoirs, we often see scenes of education where the young immigrant or the young refugee is in a classroom and is learning the English language. And what always happens is that the refugee or the immigrant is not only learning the language, he, she, or they are also learning through that language the ideology of America. So this talk is going to be about parsing some important words and their meanings, beginning with refugees versus immigrants. So what happened in my family's case was that in 1975, with the end of the war in Vietnam, there was the creation of 130,000 or so Vietnamese refugees, and my family was among them. And we came to the United States, and we were put into one of 4 refugee camps. In my family's case, our refugee camp was in the military base of Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. And I'll be honest, for most of my life, I never thought twice about the name of that fort. And I hadn't thought about it until very recently and done some research on Fort Indiantown Gap. And what I discovered is, not surprisingly, that Fort Indiantown Gap was built by white settlers in Pennsylvania to protect themselves against Native peoples, or from another perspective, to wage war against indigenous peoples. And what I also discovered is that when American soldiers went to Vietnam and built their fire bases in the Vietnamese countryside, do you know what they called that countryside around the fire bases? They called that countryside Indian country. So we Vietnamese people, in the imagination of Americans, were their Indians. And then when we came to the United States and were settled in the United States, my family ended up in a fort built to protect or wage war against Indians. That's very confusing. But at 4 years of age, I was not thinking about that. What I was thinking about was the fact that I was being separated from my parents. So in order to leave a refugee camp, the Vietnamese refugee needed an American sponsor. But there was no sponsor willing to take all 4 members of my family. So one sponsor took my parents, one sponsor took my 10-year-old brother, and one sponsor took 4-year-old me. And that's where my memories begin, howling and screaming as I'm being taken away from my parents. So I did my best to put that memory behind me because it was so difficult and so traumatic. But I was never really successful at doing that. That memory stayed with me like an invisible brand stamped between my shoulder blades. And when I became a father and my son turned 4 years of age, it was the occasion for me to reflect back on that time, to see myself through him. And also, for the very first time ever, because I'm a very self-centered person, I thought about my parents and what it must have been like for my parents to have had their children taken away from them. And I thought, there is no circumstance in the world in which I would tolerate having my son taken away from me. So this time when my son turned 4 years of age was in 2017. And this was around the time of the so-called Muslim ban. And it was also the time, if you remember, of the previous presidential administration detaining at our southern border tens of thousands of people and separating children from their parents and losing children in the bureaucratic system. And I could not, at that time, separate my feelings about that previous administration and its policy with my own memories of being separated from my parents. And I knew that those families at the border, in the detention camps, the parents who were separated from their children and vice versa, they would never forget what had happened to them. That experience would be so traumatic. And I think we as Americans have used language to try to insulate ourselves from the realities of what we as a country have done to others. Here, in this case, when it comes to what's happening at the southern border, and to a certain extent it's still happening today, we use the language of illegal immigrants to distance ourselves from those people coming from south of the border. And if we're a little more generous, we use another term, undocumented migrants. But from my position, I think the term refugees is also really appropriate for why many of those people are coming north. But politics aside, no matter what you or I may agree or disagree with on the question of our border policy, on immigration, on refugee policy, and so on, I hope we can all agree that separating children from their parents is wrong. It's a moral wrong, an ethical wrong, a political wrong. Our country has done a terrible thing, and that will be a stain forever upon us and this nation. But back to me. I was actually really lucky because I was able to come home after a few months to my parents. My brother, who was 7 years older, didn't get to come home for 2 years. And that, he likes to tell me often, is how we know Mom and Dad love you more. But don't feel too bad for him, because 7 years after coming to this country with no English, my brother graduates at the head of his high school class, and he goes to Harvard University, which is apparently what you're supposed to do when you're Asian. And then, just to rub it in, he goes to Stanford Medical School. And in my case, I went to my last choice college. So thinking about my brother, what you could see is that it's not all bad to be a refugee. And in my case, that's true too. Being a refugee has left me with the requisite emotional damage necessary to become a writer. And I have done my best to pass on that emotional damage to my son. So, like many little boys, he loves Legos. He's always asking for Legos, right? And of course, you know that you cannot give children everything they ask for. So sometimes I have to say, no, you can't have those Legos. And then I'll ask him, do you know why you can't have those Legos? And I'll think about it for a moment. And he'll say, because you're a refugee? And I'll say, exactly right. Because I want him to have empathy for refugees. I want him to remember that both of his parents and all 4 of his grandparents are refugees. And refugees are different than immigrants. It can be very important for him to know that. Now, today, the United Nations High Commission on Refugees says there are 84 million forcibly displaced people in the world today. And of those people, 26.6 million are officially classified as refugees. And the importance of language here is really crucial, because it depends whether you're called a forcibly displaced person, an asylum seeker, or a stateless person, or a refugee. So we're talking about refugees today. And I think that, at least for Americans, but also for many other countries as well, refugees are a stigmatized population. And so let me tell you something. There's no quicker way to kill a cocktail party conversation than to announce, I'm a refugee, because people don't know what to say to you. Now, if I said I'm an immigrant, I think a lot of people would say, hey, welcome to our country. Tell us about your heartwarming story of immigration and of pursuing the American dream. But being a refugee, that's different. So this point was brought home to me a few years ago when I went to give a talk at a Boise high school at a program specifically for refugee students. And so I thought I'd start off with an easy question. And I asked these students, how many of you are refugees? And almost nobody raised their hands. Then I asked them, how many of you are immigrants? And they all raised their hands. So these students who had been in the country a few months to a few years and had come from all kinds of countries that had undergone terrible things, they had already somehow learned intuitively that it was better to call themselves immigrants rather than refugees. And I think one reason why is because in the United States, the American dream is such a strong idea that most Americans cannot imagine themselves in the place of refugees. They can't imagine that this country could ever be the kind of country that produces refugees. And of course, that's simply not true. For example, some of my fellow Vietnamese refugees moved eventually to Louisiana. And 30 years later, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina hits Louisiana and displaces tens of thousands of people. Now, the American media who covered this event, some of the American media called these people refugees. And President George Bush said it is un-American to call these people refugees. And a lot of them were African Americans. And for perhaps the only time in history, Jesse Jackson agreed with George Bush and said that it is racist to call African Americans refugees. And I thought, great. We refugees have succeeded in bringing America together in hating us. So this is why I think that those of us who are refugees or have been refugees should call ourselves refugees in order to express our solidarity with the unwanted. And that's why with my short story collection, The Refugees, the dedication is to all refugees everywhere. Now, those 9 stories are focused on Vietnamese people, but the book is really about the connections between our Vietnamese refugee experience and those of refugees everywhere. And when I wrote that book, which took me, by the way, 17 years, it was my attempt at representing unrepresented or underrepresented Vietnamese people. Because my experience growing up in the 70s and 80s and then continuing into the 90s was that there weren't enough representations of Vietnamese people out there, whether from Vietnam or whether here in the United States. And I wanted, with this short story collection, to humanize Vietnamese people, because I understood that the world mostly saw us through a series of dehumanized images, through images of war. Back then, and still even today, I think most people the world over, especially in the United States, when they hear the word Vietnam or when they say the word Vietnam, what they're really talking about is not the country, but a war. By the time I finished writing The Refugees, I came to understand that my desire for representation was too limited, that this impulse for humanizing Vietnamese people that I had was wrong. And some of you may be wondering, what's wrong with being human? What's wrong with humanizing? I'm going to return to that question by the end of this talk. But nevertheless, I wanted to embrace the refugee experience. I wanted to embrace the unwanted, because I believed that it was necessary and possible to extend my sense of kinship from those people who are like me to others who are not like me. I believed that it was possible and necessary to take the far and the feared and turn them into the near and the dear. I believed, and I still believe, that if it's possible to hate those people you've never met, then it's possible to love those people you've never met as well. Now, not all of my fellow Vietnamese refugees and Vietnamese Americans feel the same way. Some of them have, in a tried and true American tradition, after coming into this country, sought to close the door behind them. What they say is that we were the good refugees. These new people, brown people, Muslims coming from south of the border and so on, these new people are the bad refugees. Well, I grew up in a Vietnamese refugee community in San Jose, California of the 1970s and 1980s. And let me tell you something. There were a lot of bad Vietnamese refugees, okay? Cash under the table welfare economies, cheating on welfare, insurance scams, domestic abuse, domestic violence, alcoholism, gambling. We were so bad, we invented a crime that the San Jose Police Department had to come up with a new term for: the home invasion. Young Vietnamese gangsters deliberately assaulting other Vietnamese people in their homes. So we were not the good refugees. We were just the lucky refugees who got let into this country because of political circumstances. But even using that binary, this language of good versus bad, is really problematic. Because, for example, what makes someone a bad refugee or a bad immigrant? I think back to those young Vietnamese men and boys who were these gangsters invading people's homes. We were terrified of them. But what made them do this? What made them bad? Was it possibly because they had seen their fathers and brothers and uncles go to war and be traumatized and come home and bring that violence into the home with them? And those other Vietnamese refugees who were cheating welfare, cheating insurance and so on, Maybe they learned how to do those things because they were forced to do them in Vietnam in order to survive a war and to survive an economy that had been artificially inflated by American aid. And the good refugees and the good immigrants, the ones who became doctors and nurses and lawyers and pharmacists and engineers and all that stuff, all these kinds of people who we need, they're doing good for themselves. But are they doing any good for anybody else? So when people call my brother and my brother became a doctor and a professor at UC San Francisco, when they call people like him and me these exceptional refugees and immigrants and so on in order to praise us and people like us, I can't help but feel that we are being held up as examples in order not to only expand refugee or immigrant policy, but oftentimes to shut it down. Because you can't just admit Pulitzer Prize winners into this country. If you did, you'd have almost nobody coming into this country at all. And I, for one, believe in an America that is equal for all. An America in which refugees and immigrants have the right to be mediocre, just like every other American. Now, the idea of goodness, superiority, merit, which all seems great, is additionally complicated if we remember that when attached to Asian immigrants and Asian Americans, these values add up to the stereotype of the model minority. And every stereotype always comes with its opposite. And in our case, the opposite of the model minority is the yellow peril. And it's not some kind of historical artifact. It's with us today, as I think we're all aware of, in this age of the pandemic, with people saying that the coronavirus is the China virus and the Kung flu. What have we seen? We have seen a resurgence of the fear of the yellow peril and a resurgence of the anti-Asian violence that has always been in this country, as long as there have been Asians in this country. And this dynamic between the model minority and the yellow peril was something my own family experienced very personally. So what happened was that in 1978, we moved from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania to San Jose, California. My parents opened perhaps the second Vietnamese grocery store in San Jose, which is what you're supposed to do when you're supposed to pursue the American dream as the good refugee or the good immigrant. So it was a real shock to me when I was about 10 or 11 years old to walk down the street from my parents' store and to see a sign in another store window that said, "Another American driven out of business by the Vietnamese." And I thought, does this person who wrote this sign, did this person know, they were thinking about my people like my parents, did this person know that my parents work 12 to 14-hour days almost every day of the year? Does this person know that my parents were shot in their store on Christmas Eve? Does this person know anything about my parents and what they have been through in order to become the people that they are and to get to this country? And of course, that person didn't know any of these things and did not care to know any of these things. To that person, my parents were not Americans, which is fair because my parents didn't call themselves Americans. But this person also didn't think of my parents as human beings. And the sad thing about this was that I internalized the ideology in those words in that sign. So a few years later, I would go to high school, mostly white high school, but there were some of us who were of Asian descent. And every day at lunch, those of us of Asian descent would gather in a corner of the campus and we would call ourselves the Asian Invasion. And the irony of us calling ourselves that is that Asians have never invaded the United States. If anything, the United States has invaded our countries. Or if invasion is too strong of a language for you, at least occupied some of our countries, invited itself into some of our countries. I'm thinking here of the Philippines, Korea, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. If you think about not just Asia formally, but the Pacific Islands, Hawaii, Guam, Samoa, so basically most of the Pacific and a lot of East and Southeast Asia. And if you think about Asia as being the Orient, and that for the French and the British, the Orient was really the Middle East or Southwest Asia, then what the United States has been doing in its forever wars since 9/11 has been also invading and occupying the Orient as well. So these American invasions and occupations are anti-Asian violence on a massive scale. So when I call myself a refugee instead of an immigrant, I'm locating myself not just in Vietnam or in Asia, but in a history of war. War as a source of migration, war as a source of refugees. We didn't just come here. We were driven here, and we were used as an alibi. Our gratitude at being rescued, masking how we wouldn't have needed rescuing by the United States if we hadn't been bombed by the United States in the first place. And Afghanistan is just the latest example of that. So the word immigrant really masks how many of us are here in the United States, not just because of the war in Vietnam, but because of forever war. Not just the forever war from 9/11 onwards, but the forever war that's really characterized most of American history. Another way of thinking about this is that I, as a refugee, I'm a refugee from an American war, but I'm also a citizen of the United States that is waging forever war. That's a very painful contradiction for me, and it was really brought home for me in the 1980s growing up by a movie. What happened was that my parents brought home a VCR in the early 1980s, and a VCR is a metal box into which you put another box, and it plays exactly one movie. So one of the first movies that I watched was Apocalypse Now. It's a movie about the war in Vietnam. And I was a war fanatic. I'd watch all kinds of war movies. I rooted for the Americans, right? So when I watched Apocalypse Now, I was an American rooting for the Americans up until the moment that the American soldiers massacred Vietnamese civilians. And at that point, I was split in two. Was I the American doing the killing, or was I the Vietnamese being killed? And I put that behind me because it was so difficult to think about. And I didn't think about it again until I went to college and I was asked to recount a scene of a movie to a college classroom. And I recounted this scene, this massacre in Apocalypse Now. And as I recounted that scene, I found myself shaking with rage and anger. And that's when I realized how powerful stories are, how visceral they are. I understood that stories could save me. Now I understood that stories could destroy me as well. And if you are a part of a so-called majority, this may not be obvious to you, because if you are part of a so-called majority, almost all the stories are about you, and you take that privilege for granted. And that's what I call narrative plenitude. And when a story about you comes along that's not a very good story, represents you in some way that's not that awesome, you can just dismiss it as just a story, because it is. Because you have 10,000 other stories about you that you can turn to. But if you are a part of a so-called minority, you exist in narrative scarcity. Almost none of the stories are about you. So when a story about you comes along, you get very excited. You put a lot of pressure, a big burden on that story to represent you. So stories matter. You can't just say stories are just stories. They matter. And so when a story about us comes along, we kind of freak out. Crazy Rich Asians, when it came out, all the Asians freaked out. We're like, oh my God, here's a movie about us. Too bad it's not a very good movie. But realizing that stories matter and that stories could save and destroy me made me into a writer. I followed in the path set down by Muhammad Ali when he says that writing is fighting. I believe in that. And one place to fight is in language, and another place to fight is in memory. So the opening of one of my books, Nothing Ever Dies, is all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And so growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, I understood this very clearly, that Hollywood, and therefore America, was fighting the Vietnam War all over again by making so many movies about this war. And I saw almost all those Hollywood movies. And it's an exercise I recommend to nobody, especially if you're Vietnamese, because this was our war. This was our country. And yet we had almost no voice in these Hollywood movies, except to scream, to curse, to speak gibberish, to have no language except maybe to say thank you. So when I wrote my novels, The Sympathizer and The Committed, I refused to say thank you in these books. Because to me, for a refugee or a Vietnamese person in the context of this war, to say thank you to America for rescuing us was an act not just of expressing gratitude, but an act of apology, an apology for our existence. We're sorry you had to fight this war on our behalf. We're sorry to be here in your country. Accept our gratitude, accept our apology, accept our humanity. Saying thank you was a way of proving our humanity. But we didn't need to prove our humanity. Why? We're already human. To prove our humanity only proves our inferiority, because people of the so-called majority take their humanity for granted. They never have to prove their humanity to anybody. So why and what do we need to prove? For me, growing up in the United States, I did feel, though, a need to prove humanity. And the way that I proved it was through mastering English. I was determined to be better at English than Americans themselves. But that's a double-edged sword, because with that kind of an attitude, what I was also agreeing to was my own colonization. Colonization is a process of conquest, but also of migration. And the irony, of course, is that all of those people who are descended from colonizers and migrants, they often don't want more migrants coming in, because I think these new migrants remind them of their origins or their ancestries of origin as migrants. Now, Europe itself colonized the world for 500 years. And in so doing, Europeans justified this colonization by saying that they were human and everyone else they encountered was less than human. And the irony of all of this was that this humanity justified enormous amounts of inhumanity. So when Europeans say civilizing mission and Americans say manifest destiny, the colonized often hear instead conquest, genocide, slavery, and war. When I say things like this in the United States, sometimes Americans will respond by saying, that's not right. We never colonized anybody. It's the Europeans who colonized people. Americans have never colonized anybody. We are an exceptional country. If you believe that, what you should do is ask indigenous people whether or not there has ever been colonization in the United States. I think we have colonized this country. I think we have very successfully colonized this country. Only we don't call colonization by its name in the United States. We call colonization instead the American dream. It's a great marketing term, great use of language. The American dream becomes a vehicle for this ideology that we're the exceptional country that has never colonized anyone. And in this American dream and in this ideology, the immigrant functions as the alibi for the American dream. Because the immigrant can come to this country, become successful, and therefore prove America's greatness. And the immigrant forgets that they come here as a settler, just like other settlers before them. So the Sympathizer deals with this contradiction between humanity and inhumanity, civilization and colonization in Vietnam, colonized by France, occupied by the United States. When we're talking about France and the United States, we're talking about countries where there were democratic revolutions, important democratic revolutions, and then countries that then came to Vietnam and suppressed a movement for independence. If you haven't read The Sympathizer, shame on you. But all you really need to know about this novel is that I wrote it in order to offend everybody. Americans, South Vietnamese, North Vietnamese, anti-communists, communists, and judging from my hate mail, I've succeeded. Now, it's obvious, I think, judging from this talk, why some Americans would be offended. But why would the Vietnamese be offended? And they have been, both the communists and the anti-communists. And the answer to why Vietnamese of all backgrounds have been offended by this novel is that, regardless of their politics and how much they might hate each other, these Vietnamese of all sides are united in their belief that they are only human. That's what they want to believe in. We are human, and our enemies are the inhuman ones. So the communist Vietnamese think the anti-communist Vietnamese are the inhuman enemies. The anti-communist Vietnamese think the communist Vietnamese are the monsters and the demons and the devils. And this is a mistake with serious consequences. And the reason why is because, in fact, we are human and inhuman at the same time. This is a lesson I learned from Apocalypse Now, watching that movie. What that movie shows is that the colonizer first claims humanity as a justification for colonization and warfare and occupation and all that stuff. And then in the aftermath, the colonizer claims inhumanity by expressing regret over the terrible things that the colonizer has done. Either way, human or inhuman, the colonizer keeps his place at the center of the American story, and therefore, because of American power, at the center of the global story. So we who have been dehumanized by the process of colonization, we don't need to prove our humanity, because in the end, being human is only a trap. It's a way for us to marginalize ourselves by thinking of ourselves only as angels or as victims. Now, I don't know what kinds of stories or narratives you like. I don't like stories about angels and victims. They are very, to me, uninteresting. Instead, I, as a reader and as a writer, want to claim that full humanity is to also acknowledge our inhumanity. And in that way, by claiming both humanity and inhumanity, we put ourselves at the center of our story. That's what I sought to do in The Sympathizer and in The Committed. And in The Committed, which is the sequel to The Sympathizer, I continued this centering of our humanity and inhumanity. And I also asked myself the question, who else is there left to offend? The answer, obviously, is the French. So France colonized Vietnam, and of course, that was before the United States. The French came there with their civilizing mission, and the Americans came in and took over with American exceptionalism. And the narrator of these two novels is part French and part Vietnamese. So in The Committed, he sets out for France. But the opening of The Committed is on a boat on the South China Sea, or the East Sea, depending on your perspective, a boat full of refugees fleeing from Vietnam in the late 1970s. And we're all familiar with this story and with the images of these people on boats. We're so familiar with them because, speaking of language, the term that the American media and Western media came out with to describe these people was boat people. Very powerful term that's still with us today. Now, speaking of the French are really opposed to importing English words into their language. But do you know what they call boat people in France? Les boat people. I find that really problematic because these are not boat people. These are oceanic refugees at the very least, and at the most, they are heroes. Because many of those people who stepped foot on those boats understood that their odds were terrible. Some estimates say that about half the people who tried to escape in this way never made it. And these people knew the odds. So why are we calling them boat people instead of heroes? Because if it was white people doing this, they would be heroes, all right? Now, Christopher Columbus and the Pilgrims, they were boat people, okay? They were just lucky that there were no cameras there. Otherwise, indigenous people would have been taking photographs of Columbus or the Pilgrims coming off their boats after months and months and months at sea. And what would they show? That Columbus and the Pilgrims were this sweaty, stinky, unshaven, unwashed, lice-ridden lot. But the indigenous peoples didn't have cameras. So instead we have oil paintings depicting Columbus and the Pilgrims as heroes. Well, there were also migrants and colonizers. So I go around the country saying things like this, and oftentimes the response of some Americans is love it or leave it. I think for these Americans, when they say the word America, it is a word with one meaning for them. And that is very dangerous. It's a fundamentalism of meaning. And as a writer, I can't accept that words only have one meaning. For me, America, the country and the word, has many meanings, often contradictory. And this perception comes from my refugee experience and my relationship to language. I find myself both inside and outside of English. I see words from the inside and the outside. And that's inseparable from seeing this country with the refugees yearning to be inside, and yet also seeing this country from the outside as an excluded refugee. And because of this, I think I can see both the inhumanity and the humanity of this country at the same time. A country of both brutality and beauty, a country of both horror and hope. And this duality is disturbing to some, but to me, seeing the United States in this way from inside and outside allows a truer understanding of this country, a truer understanding achieved not only through experience, but also through language. Thank you. UC Irvine.
Thank you so much for that talk, Viet. I know being virtual makes it really difficult to hear the cheers and applauses that I'm sure is happening among all the audience here. We had over 200 people attending this talk tonight. And I think so for those of you in the audience who have questions, please go ahead and start putting them into the Q&A box, and we will sort through those and get to them soon. But I wanted to kind of initiate this Q&A first by thanking you really for this incredible work. You've been an ambassador for so many of us, and you actually are a Southeast Asian Archive ambassador. So for UC Irvine in particular, this work is so important, right? As you're doing the writing, you're also going out to build relationships and to make these connections that might become new archival collections for us in the Southeast Asian Archive. So I want to thank you for that work. And so you began your talk by sharing with us a little bit about fluency in Vietnamese, right? I wanted to ask you the first question about the role of Vietnamese language in your life today, presently. I'm sure I see so many Vietnamese names in the audience. If you can talk and share with us, how you think about the language, how you use it, what role does it play in your own life?
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to know that there's Vietnamese people in the audience. Maybe some of them were booing along with cheering, who knows, right? So anyway, the other thing to know about me, I didn't really talk about it, I didn't talk about it at all, is that I'm not just Vietnamese. I am a Vietnamese Catholic, okay? And what that basically means is, Vietnamese culture is conservative and guilt-inducing. Catholic culture is conservative and guilt-inducing. So to be a Vietnamese Catholic is to be very, conservative and guilty. And that was my relationship, both to being Vietnamese, but also to the Vietnamese language. Because, I grew up basically thinking that I have to be an American. And yet I have these very Vietnamese parents who would tell me that I am 100% Vietnamese. And the tragedy of it was that there was, in my mind, no way to balance these two things. Like, I could not see a world where I could both speak Vietnamese and English at the same time. And that was partly due to my own autobiographical circumstances. I think a lot of Vietnamese people grew up in large families and so on. They could speak the language in the family. I grew up basically by myself. My brother went off to college, and I was left alone with my parents. And it was really sad because I wanted to be able to communicate with my parents, but I couldn't communicate with my parents as time passed. And I think at some subconscious level, I made a decision, as I sort of implied at the end of the talk, that I was going to master English. This was going to be my way of fitting into this country, but more than just fitting in, my way of like fighting for a place for myself and then eventually a place for whoever I saw as my community. But there was a huge cost to that, and that cost was being able to communicate with my parents. And so they saw that happening. You know, this is a very basic immigrant and refugee story. So they tried to hire people to tutor me in Vietnamese. They sent me to Vietnamese Catholic troop. They sent me to Vietnamese language programs. And these were terrible, terrible, terrible experiences. If there's other people who had great experiences in Vietnamese Catholic troop and Sunday school, I'd be happy to hear it. I thought it was kind of like, you know, deeply conservative and even fascistic in some ways. So that was another reason for me to back away from Vietnamese culture. But I tried my best to recover the language in college. Again, I went to Berkeley. We didn't have a great Vietnamese language program, but I was, you know, forever plagued by guilt. And so I would always try to learn the language at periodic moments. And so eventually I did go to Vietnam and study Vietnamese formally at the Vietnam National University as an adult for 7 months. If by study, what you mean is going to nightclubs and drinking a lot, which is what I actually did instead of studying Vietnamese. So, you know, I still have a very guilt-ridden relationship to the Vietnamese language. I mean, I can pass as being able to speak Vietnamese for about 5 minutes because I think my accent is okay. My vocabulary is kind of limited. But I do my best, like I said, to torment my son. You know, he's forced to take Vietnamese, right? So he's a good sport about it. You know, his accent's actually pretty good. You know, we made bánh chưng together for det, and he can say bánh chưng, and he actually liked bánh chưng. So I'm doing my best to try to pass on the Vietnamese culture and language to my son, but in ways that I find, I hope, are more progressive. Like for me, the difficulty was always separating the Vietnamese language and Vietnamese culture from all the stuff about the war and trauma and Catholicism and shame and guilt. I would love my son to be able to grow up as a Vietnamese American who is not burdened by all the negative stuff about history and religion and obligation and all that. I don't know if it's possible, but I'm gonna try.
I think it is. And I actually think that karaoke would provide that avenue for me, at least. Retaining Vietnamese was done through karaoke, but back in the day in the day of the laser discs, right? Most of the songs were nostalgic South Vietnamese war songs. So it is all tied up with that that vexed history. You know, as you were talking about this quote that's now quoted everywhere, I feel like I can't turn a corner without hearing the quote, "All wars are fought twice," right? The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. Is it on a t-shirt yet?
Oh, no, but that's a good idea. I should put that out there.
Well, I think we both know an excellent t-shirt designer. But, you know, that recently, Lisa Ling put out an episode on Little Saigon, right? And began with that quote, actually. So as you were saying it sort of brought me back into the way that we're starting to approach a moment, I think, when narrative plenitude might be possible, right? When we're seeing more narratives of ourselves circulating in different spaces from film and, you know, fiction and so on. And so we have a question in the audience. Actually, there are many questions that are related to what people, I think, have heard, which is the HBO series based on your book, The Sympathizer. Can you share more about that?
Yeah. If you have not yet read The Sympathizer, congratulations. You will never have to read The Sympathizer. You can just watch the TV series instead. So, yeah, the big news is it's really happening because we're casting at the moment. And, HBO has committed to a date for the screening or whatever the broadcast of this in late 2023, I believe. The ambition is to start shooting in the summer here in LA. And, obviously we also hope to try to do this in Vietnam as well. We have Vietnamese production partners that are trying to secure permission to shoot in Vietnam. The director is Park Chan-wook, who is the ideal director, in my opinion, because if you haven't watched his movies, you should. His movie Old Boy was a major influence on The Sympathizer in terms of outrageousness and style. And The Handmaiden is a fantastic movie about Japanese colonization that should have won or should have been nominated for an Academy Award. And Park Chan-wook is just such a incredible artistic genius, both in terms of his ability to tell a story, but how he makes his movies look. But I think he's the perfect person for this. And it was his idea, actually, to cast one white male actor to play all the white male roles in the novel. And so I assume Robert Downey Jr. just thought that was an attractive, lure and agreed to do this. And of course, nobody cares about Viet Thanh Nguyen. Everybody cares about Robert Downey Jr. Oh my God, Robert Downey Jr. is going to be in the TV series. Okay, fine. If that's what it takes for people to come to this story, I can agree to that, because I really hope that the Sympathizer adaptation will be as entertaining as the novel, but also I hope as politically provocative as the novel. So people come to watch this series because of Iron Man, and then wham, we hit them with a critique of American warfare, genocide, white supremacy, and the call for decolonization. That's the hope.
That would be amazing. Are you going to have a cameo?
I haven't talked about that yet with Park Chan-wook. I mean, all I really want to do is to be blown up. I think that's the fate that a writer deserves who sells his book to TV.
I would totally watch for that moment, Viet. So sign me up. I really, really appreciated your explanation of American occupation and America's occupation and invasion of Asia, right? Particularly Southeast Asia, as this kind of global scale of anti-Asian violence, because so many of us have been witnessing and burdened by it and anxious about the scale of anti-Asian violence since 2020. So for those who do work on the ground to combat anti-Asian violence in our American cities, how might understanding this historical transnational context enable ways to mobilize and create solidarities among us?
I think that the Asian American population is huge and diverse. And the one thing that tends to unify us, or the two things that tend to unify us, are number one, food. Everybody says, oh yeah, we love boba, we love pho, that's awesome. And then the other thing that unifies us is anti-Asian violence, because we understand that it's being directed at us not because we are Chinese, because a lot of us are not Chinese. It's being directed at us because anti-Asian people can't tell the difference between one Asian population and the other. So it doesn't matter if they're saying China virus and all that. They'll kill Thai people too for the same reason. So that unifies us. But beyond that sense of unity, there's so much diversity in the Asian American community, including political and ideological diversity. And what that means is you have radical Asian Americans on the one hand, you have conservative Asian Americans on the other, you have liberals in between. And I think the efforts to combat anti-Asian violence that don't have the kind of understanding that you're talking about, the global, transnational, transhistorical understanding, but focus purely on the idea that anti-Asian violence is bad, obviously, but that we can combat it with resorting to these tried and true American ideas about justice and equality and all of that, that's going to fail. That's going to fail. Anti-Asian violence, like I said, has existed in this country as long as there have been Asians here. And it doesn't matter how often we turn to the rhetoric of justice and equality and all of that. Of course, it helps, but it's not going to solve the problem, because the root of anti-Asian violence is not purely within the United States. Now, yes, anti-Asian violence happens partly because of economic fear and competition and all that kind of stuff, but a lot of it just comes out of pure racism. And where does that racism come from? The racism comes from the fact that the United States, throughout, from 1898 onwards, the United States as a global power has been built on fighting wars in Asia and the Pacific. And racism has been absolutely fundamental to that. So to imagine that white people or any other population, and it's not just white people, but Americans killing or inflicting violence on Asian Americans or Asian immigrants in the United States is purely an American phenomenon is a complete misunderstanding of how and why anti-Asian violence takes place. It's not just one factor, it's a complicated factor that goes back, in my argument, to colonization, warfare, global capitalism, and the deeply ambivalent place that Asians occupy in the American imagination. Here in the United States, as workers who are both ideal workers in some ways and a complete threat to the United States, as I mentioned. And that is connected to the way that Asia in general is imagined by the United States, but also by a lot of Western Europe and Australia and New Zealand in exactly the same way. The source of economic competition and the source of military geopolitical competition and threat as well. So unless we understand that, we don't understand the scale of and the endurance of the anti-Asian problem we're up against.
Yeah, I see so many people in the chat, I think, wanting to follow up on that question about colonization and the American dream. But I want to pivot a little bit to asking some of these questions that are more about the language aspect of your talk. So one writer, this should be a quick and easy one. One audience member asked that there appears to be recent controversy, I don't know if it's recent, but about hyphenating terms like Vietnamese American or Italian American, etc. What's your opinion about the hyphenation?
I'm not sure if the question is about the literal hyphen or just the idea that you can have Asian American, Vietnamese American, Italian American, and so on. But you know, the actual hyphen was a matter of grammatical controversy for a long time, and that seems to be done and over with. You know, you rarely see the hyphen, for example, between Viet and Nam or between Asian and American. So we've solved that problem, I think, because as Maxine on Kingston, my teacher, said so very clearly, you know, including the hyphen literally simply comes to signify this idea that Asian Americans or anybody else who are hyphenated are somehow divided against themselves. And the hyphen as a concept, like, you know, should we have these hybrid identities of being Vietnamese or Asian American, for example? And that identity doesn't exist in every country. You know, for France, for example, where I did research, there's a significant Asian population, Vietnamese population, but the French definitely do not believe in hyphenated identities. You are French all the way. And if you're not French, then you are the one with the problem, not the French who deny that racism exists. Now, that's one kind of possibility. The Americans have embraced another one, which is this multicultural hyphenation. So there's a debate about which system is better, the French idea of, you know, universally being able to be just French, or the American idea of having pluralistic hyphenated identities. Will either of these approaches solve what we see in both countries, which are, you know, problems with racism and xenophobia and all of that? And my take on this is neither system will solve the problem. Because unless France and the United States and other countries like them confront that how they are built on things like slavery and imperialism and colonization, which is why these populations, hyphenated or otherwise, exist in France and the United States, unless these countries are able to fully confront how foundational slavery, colonization, and imperialism have been to their countries, they will never get rid of these problems, and instead they will continue to blame the hyphenated people or the unhyphenated people for these kinds of issues.
Thank you for that. We also have another question that's about the technicality of writing and language. As a writer, what's your take on italicizing words foreign to English in writing?
Good question, too. It's related to this idea that, of course, we who do not speak English or who are not white or not European are somehow foreigners both to the country and to the language, assuming English to be the unofficial language of the United States. And the italics are symbolic of how it is that we who are supposedly different from the majority are always expected to italicize our difference in one way or another, right? And when you see the italics happening in a text, it's a function of translation. So, for example, you know, I brought up the pho example before. If you were to put pho in a text now, you would be expected usually to italicize pho as if it's a foreign word. Well, at what point do we not italicize pho? Because it's just like spaghetti. Do we italicize spaghetti? No. So at what point do we make that transition? But even more than that, when we italicize a word, we're expected to translate it. pho, comma, a delicious beef noodle soup, comma. We're never expected to translate spaghetti or sandwich or anything else like that, but we're expected to italicize, to translate what it is that's italicized. And that's, so the symbolic meaning of italicization is so important. And that's why there's an important need for us to reject it. Because in fact, we who are supposedly different are constantly expected to translate ourselves to the supposed majority or mainstream. And this is true not just for writers writing, because in Asian American literature or other literatures by migrants or refugees or peoples of color, you will often see the performance of translation taking place. And of course, that if you are in the same community, you never translate. Like if I'm talking to you, I would not say to you, Thuy, pho, a delicious beef noodle soup. We just know what pho is, just like everybody else knows what a stupid sandwich is, right? Mm-hmm. So when you translate in a text, you are already signifying who you're talking to, and you're not talking to people like yourself. And part of my claim as a writer is to say that we who are supposedly minority writers, we should never translate ourselves. Because white writers don't translate themselves. They expect everybody else to understand what it is that they're saying, as they should. I don't read Jonathan Franzen and expect him to translate Midwestern culture to me. I understand I have to come to him. Likewise, when I write my books, I expect my readers to come to me. And this is true not just for literature, but for so many other professional discourses and interactions that we have. I think so many supposed minorities and people of color can relate to this idea that when they find themselves to be the sole person of color, for example, in a meeting or a company or something like that, they're expected to be translators to explain themselves. Yeah. So it's a wide-ranging kind of condition. We should reject that italicization in that translation.
And this reminds me of James Clifford talks about diaspora. And then he asked this question, so when does diaspora become indigenous? Right? So the idea that quote unquote spaghetti quote unquote is indigenous. Right. So pho should be indigenous. If we think about, like all these things, sandwich is indigenous and pho is indigenous. We don't translate sushi anymore. Right. We don't italicize sushi. It becomes part of the culture already. And then also just continuing with the idea of language, there's a question about refugee. So the question is, if you want to talk about being refugee in 3 words, what are the 3 words? This is from the audience.
3 words. 3 words. Oh gosh, I have no idea. The Sympathizer, for example, is like 400 pages. It's like 140,000 words. So to get it down to 3 words is really hard. But like I said, stigmatized, traumatized, and hopeful. Let's say, right? Because it's out of the control of refugees that they're stigmatized and traumatized. They're traumatized by the experience that produced them as refugees. They're stigmatized by other people who are not refugees, who look on them as literally less than human. If you read a lot of refugee memoirs and literature and so on, the idea that they've been dehumanized is recurrent in all of these stories, right? But hopeful. I use hopeful rather than desperate, because desperate is how the rest of the world sees refugees, and I don't like that language. It's attached to that idea of the boat people. Mm-hmm. But I prefer to think of refugees as being hopeful, that they can get themselves to a different place of settlement. And just connect that back to what Daphne was talking about, the indigenous and the settlement. We come here to this country as refugees or migrants, for example. We bring our food with us and so on. And of course, part of the mythology of the United States is that we are a melting pot, a mosaic, a salad bowl, whatever metaphor you want to come up with. But food is really important to that, right? So yes, now Italian Americans are just Americans and everybody loves pizza and spaghetti and everything like that. And so is our dream that one day everybody, no matter where they are in the country, can have a good bowl of pho and boba on the side? Have we achieved the American dream if we get to that point? And maybe we would have, but at what cost are we talking about here? And I think the reason why I bring this up is related to the colonization question. I think some people have some issues or questions about that. Part of the irony of being a refugee like me and coming to this country and becoming a citizen, as I've tried to imply, is that on the one hand, that's a good thing, to become a citizen, to become a part of this country and all that kind of stuff. But I'm inextricably then intertwined into this history of settler colonialism that shaped this country and is still a part of this country. This country is still a settler colonial society. That's why I brought up the Fort Indiantown Gap example, that this is how we became Americans, is by entering through a portal that was created to destroy Indians. And that is something that, again, most Americans, including refugees and immigrants and Asian Americans, don't want to think about or have never thought about, because the power of this American ideology, the American dream of settler colonialism, is so strong, we don't even think about it. Once you start thinking about settler colonialism, I think you'll start to realize how deeply embedded our assumptions are in our language, that we use the language of settlement constantly, and the assumptions that it's our right and our prerogative to come here to this country and to own property, and by owning property, own a share of the American dream. It's naturalized through our language and our ideology.
Yeah, I'm really appreciating how you're really bringing in the intersectional and relational experiences that, Vietnamese refugees and other refugee groups might have with a much longer history of colonialism. One of the questions, earlier you mentioned the institution of slavery, and we have several folks in the audience who were really compelled by you bringing up Hurricane Katrina. One of the questions is asking you if you know what the reception to your book has been like in the Black community.
That's a good question. I don't have anecdotal evidence, like I haven't done a survey or a poll or anything like that, but I'm encouraged by the fact that there are Black readers of these books, for example. And so I'll quote two who have contacted me, former Dean Ernest Wilson at USC, tells me after reading the Sympathizer and the Committed that I got it right when it comes to the way that this country has integrated imperialism into racism, so that anti-Black racism is part of a continuum that is linked to anti-Asian racism, and the fact that Black people were brought here as a part of the colonization process to help found a colonizing country is inseparable from the warfare that was waged against natives and the warfare that would be then extended into Asia as well. And then it was also really validating to get messages from Raoul Peck, the director of I'm Not Your Negro and Exterminate All the Brutes on HBO, which you all should watch, both of those. And Raoul Peck, has a Haitian background, also, an American and a French background as well. And after reading The Committed, he reached out to me and said, this is a very good, depiction of the French colonizing process and the treatment not just of Asians, but of Africans, Black Africans, and the French of African descent also. And so I think it's been really important to me in writing these novels that they are not just novels of the Vietnamese refugee experience or the Vietnam War, but novels about colonization and imperialism. Now, when I wrote The Sympathizer, obviously it's about the Vietnam War. Obviously, this is how I would be received. This is how the domestic racial politics of the United States works. You're a racial minority, you're a person of color, we're good at celebrating this kind of stuff in the United States, so you get your month, your week, your day, your celebration, you get your slot in multiculturalism, which means that I, as a Vietnamese person, get the Vietnam War. I get to write about that. So when I wrote that book, I thought this is not just about the Vietnam War. This is about colonialism and American imperialism and all this, but Americans will see it as about the Vietnam War. That's exactly what happened. So when I for a number of reasons, I wanted to write a sequel and a trilogy, and one of the reasons was to write The Committed and set it in France was to demonstrate that if you read these two books back to back, that American imperialism and the American war in Vietnam are inseparable from French colonialism, right? This is something Americans want to deny. But hopefully if you read these two books together, you realize that the larger critique is about colonialism and imperialism, of which the war in Vietnam is but one part. And if you think in that way, nothing in our lives can be separated, so that anti-Asian racism and wars in Asia, American wars in Asia, cannot again be separated from anti-Black racism. Martin Luther King Jr. expresses very succinctly in his speech Beyond Vietnam when he said, look, the war in Vietnam is racist, imperialist, militaristic, and capitalistic. He says this. And poor black men are being sent to fight that war. And it's inseparable that they descend from enslaved populations, they live in continued conditions of segregation and exploitation, and then they are airlifted to Vietnam to fight a racist war against Asians. That pretty much says it all about the necessity to think about how all of our conditions and our histories are intertwined together, back then and still today.
Yeah, and then there's another question about relating that to Jewish American experience as well.
Yeah.
Is that a question?
So the question from our audience is, do you think that the Asian community, however broadly defined, might learn something from the American Jewish experience?
Okay, all right. I'm going to say some stuff that might get me into trouble because it's a very controversial issue. So when I was growing up, one of the major influences on me, and it's manifest in the Sympathizer, was Philip Roth, Jewish American writer. Okay, I read Portnoy's Complaint by Philip Roth at 12 years of age, perhaps, and Portnoy's Complaint is about Alex Portnoy, Jewish American, American-born, and looking at that world that he depicted, I realized that Vietnamese refugees and Jewish Americans are not the same. But the kinds of things that Roth was talking about resonated so strongly. This tension and clash between American culture and Jewish culture, the idea of being supposedly ethnic in a world of whiteness, the desire for upward mobility and assimilation, all of that resonated so strongly. And of course, what happened to Roth was that he started off as a Jewish American writer in the 1950s, and when he died a couple of years ago, he ended up by being no longer just or only Jewish American, but an American writer and a global writer. So in many ways, his trajectory and the trajectory of Jewish Americans as a whole have a lot of inspiration and parallels for Vietnamese and Asian Americans. Now, how do we, and the other reason why it really resonated was because of the history of the Holocaust was hanging over Roth and his work, and I felt it's sort of an echo in that the Vietnam War was always hanging over me. So all of that is really, really crucial. Roth confronted anti-Semitism in the United States, but he also confronted hypocrisies within the Jewish American world. And so he was actually a very controversial writer among Jewish Americans, especially in the 1950s with his first book, Goodbye Columbus. And so I also took inspiration from that because I feel that my function as a writer is not to elevate Vietnamese people. My function as a writer is to tell the truth about the United States, but also about Vietnamese people. And there are a lot of Vietnamese people, just like there are a lot of American people who, from my perspective, don't want to hear the truth. They want to be elevated, right? And so that's why there's a lot of Vietnamese people who don't like me. That's fine. But here's the other rub. We live in a complex world. And so on the one hand, we absolutely have to be committed to opposing anti-Semitism, no matter who we are, no matter where it manifests itself. And yet, if we were to draw up another kind of a parallel, there's a difference between Jewish Americans and anti-Semitism and Israel and Palestine. Mm-hmm. And this is where it gets controversial, right? Because I am opposed to what I see as the Israeli occupation of Palestine. I am opposed to what I see as Israeli colonization of Palestine. I recommend that you read Ilan Pappé's The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. Pappé is actually an Israeli historian who goes back and looks at the documents and says, look, what the foundation of the Israeli state demonstrates is that this was an act of violence and ethnic cleansing and appropriation, all these kinds of things that a lot of people don't want to talk about. So it's totally possible that we live in a contradictory world where I think we should be opposed to anti-Semitism no matter where it manifests itself, and we should be opposed to Israeli occupation of Palestine. And I will extend that to the situation in Vietnam. I think we hold ourselves to the same standards. So when I said that, when Americans go and they wage wars in Asia, that this is massive anti-Asian violence, I'm not letting Asians off the hook. Because Asians have killed a lot of Asians too, right? And we have to be, in my opinion, critical of both American imperialism and the kinds of things that Asians have done to each other. And in the case of Vietnam, that's why in the Sympathizer, I draw a lot of attention to the fact that even though there was American imperialism in Vietnam and American occupation in Vietnam, the Vietnamese are still responsible for what they have done to each other, and that we just can't blame the Americans for everything, and that in fact the Vietnamese of both sides committed atrocities against each other in various ways. And the Vietnamese, both sides, as I tried to imply in the talk, don't want to hear this kind of story.
Yeah, and I think that nuance and complexity that you bring to your storytelling is something that a lot of our audience is gravitating towards. So I want to kind of turn us inward into talking a little bit more about the Vietnamese or Vietnamese American community. There are two questions actually that one person draws out some of the scenes of domestic abuse or Vietnamese men being violent, drawing a parallel, a link, a through line, right, to what they had experienced in war, and that PTSD is a very prevalent aspect of our community life. So this person wanted to know if you've collaborated, if you've talked to folks, mental health providers, counselors, or others about PTSD and trauma as related to the Vietnam War, as related to our refugee experience.
In fact, I'm the host of a show called Accented, which is about diasporic Vietnamese and Southeast Asian cultures. And our last episode about 10 days ago was exactly on this topic of mental health in the Vietnamese American community. It was a great episode. I thought it was so productive of a conversation because, as we all know, talking about mental health in immigrant, refugee, and Asian American and Vietnamese communities is really, really difficult for a number of cultural and historical factors. And yet, at the same time, I think so many of us are aware that the experiences of being a refugee, of being an immigrant, of facing racism, of surviving war have deeply traumatized our parents and our grandparents and our siblings, and they and we, don't often have a language for describing that. I mean, literally in Vietnamese, for example, but also just in between each other as well. So it's very difficult to talk about these things in public. In some ways, it's easier to talk about these massive historical concepts like warfare or communism or anti-communism versus talking about the ways by which these histories have then impacted people at the individual, familial, social level. So that for me, I've always felt that history has been very intimate for me. I feel like history has rippled through me emotionally. And through my parents and through everybody that I knew in the Vietnamese refugee community, because, part of how we survived as Vietnamese refugees is that we just learned how to suck it up, deal with it, all the terrible things that people had gone through. And what was striking to me was that everybody had been through this. What would be remarkable if somebody had not gone through war and the refugee experience and had lost people and had suffered in some way. In fact, we were bound by the normality of the traumas that characterized our family histories, right? And so we just learned to accept it and not talk about it, usually, is what happens. And so to be able to talk about it in public, or at least to be able to talk about it with a therapist or with your own family, and much less in public, these are really crucial therapeutic steps, to be able to talk about things in public and to be able to control our own narrative. I think there is, I'm not a professional, okay, but I think there is an idea out there that one way that we can deal with trauma is to take over the narration of trauma. People who are traumatized can't control their own narration. By definition, when you're traumatized, the traumatic event becomes something that you circle around, that you oftentimes can't even articulate, right? So to be able to tell a story, to re-narrate your experience is really, really crucial, both at the individual level, but also at the familial level, the social level, the community level, and then ultimately at this national and global level as well. And so much of my talk has been about language, but also about storytelling, about the importance of narrative and being able to tell a different story, right? And if we are not able to tell this story in response to the original question of trauma, we're going to keep on repeating that trauma. And I think that's what we see in immigrant, refugee, and Vietnamese communities is oftentimes the repetition of trauma without people being even aware that they're repeating the trauma.
Yeah, that definitely resonates so much with the work that we have been doing at UC Irvine to collect oral histories of Vietnamese Americans One question from our audience that's kind of related to that previous mental health question is, have you ever collaborated with your brother, who is the other kind of doctor, right? To write about trauma, to write about the trauma of being a refugee and the impact on health of the Vietnamese community?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think my brother is 7 years older officially than I am, and so he was always this much older figure for me. And we come from a family and a particular lineage of very stoic people, right? So being emotional and open is not a characteristic of my family or my extended family or my ancestors. And so we have collaborated a little bit as adults, because my brother, here's an interesting thing, when I was growing up and then as a young adult, I was seen by my family as the black sheep of the family, as a rebellious person, the one who went to Berkeley and became a radical and all that kind of thing. My brother was the conservative one. And so then President Trump gets elected and my brother basically becomes a very different person. He had been the co-commissioner, the co-head of the White House Commission on Asian American and Pacific Islanders under the Obama administration. Obviously, he has to quit that position under the Trump administration, and he just becomes a radical. My brother becomes the angry one. He becomes angrier than I am, right? And so that was very interesting. And then he sets off and he helps to start the Pivot, the Progressive Vietnamese Network, the first sort of national grassroots Vietnamese American political organization. And so we've collaborated there with Pivot. I've done events with him there. But I'm writing a memoir in which he does appear, in which obviously my family appears, and many of the issues that I've talked about, including mental health issues, are in this book. And my brother's, becoming very public, talking about our mother's difficult to talk about our mother's mental health issues too. So we will have to talk about it eventually. I'm going to show him the manuscript, and like just even yesterday or the day before on Facebook, he posted something about what happened to my mother in 1975, and I knew the vague outlines of that, but his description of what actually happened was shocking to me because I don't remember. I don't remember that, and I don't have a way of narrating that. So we will, I think, have to eventually collaborate when I show him the manuscript and hear what he has to say.
Thank you for that, Viet, and thank you for being vulnerable with us. Well, I have to wrap up now, but I know there are so many more questions that we weren't able to answer. I just wanted to share, though, that part of the talk really was just incredible. I learned so much, but I also felt so seen through hearing your words. And I love that you left us with the sense that we're fighting, right? Fighting. We have tools to fight back, to fight through language, to fight through memory work, which is what I do. And one of my favorite parts is when you called Christopher Columbus and his posse boat people. So thank you for that. I'm going to pass it back to Daphne.
Yeah, I just want to say that thank you so much. And I know you are writing a memoir right now. And so, I can just imagine from today's talk that it is not a personal memoir, it's also the memoir for the community. It's also the memoir for the nation. So we're looking forward to reading that memoir. Okay, thank you so much. I hope everyone has had, just like me, I was totally moved and I learned so much today. And there's just so much for me to think about. So before we leave, I want everyone to join me in thanking our distinguished guest today. And I just think we have so much to reflect on today. And also before we go, I want to remind everyone of the upcoming UCI Illuminations event. Other than the two things we dropped in the link in the chat, one is the UCI DIY project, and another one is the exhibit, literally Displaced, that's happening right now. Also next week, we have on February 8th, we have Story in the Shadow of the Refugee Regime. It's a talk by Mylin Hong. And then we have two exciting events on environmental justice in March. One is called Cleaning Up Kingspan, from London's Grenfell Tower fire to Santa Ana Skylight Factory. And another one is In the Wake of Formosa Plastic, Rebuilding Coastal Communities, Texas, Taiwan, and Vietnam. So we have a lot of Illuminations event coming up. So check out our website. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you, Viet and Thuy. And I hope to see you again at UCI in person sometime soon. Have a good evening, everyone. Yeah.
Good night, everybody.